Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're just going to give it a few minutes to start as folks trickle in. Welcome to today's webinar. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'll just give it maybe another minute while people trickle in. All right. Well, maybe I'll get started. Welcome to our webinar titled Meet Sandrine Blais, NEA Conservation Fellow. My name is Greg Stewart, and I'm the Education Programs Manager at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCAHA, as we say, and I use they and he pronouns. For accessibility's sake, I will say I am a white person with dark hair, glasses, I'm wearing a pink top, and I'm in a yellow room with some doors and a bookshelf behind me. So today you're basically going to get a glimpse into our paper conservation lab as I mentioned, Sandrine, our NEA Conservation Fellow, addresses the unique challenges of working with everything from Japanese screens, contemporary works on paper, Renaissance drawings, just to name a few. So Sandrine's going to discuss her research projects and some of the highlights of her fellowship here at the center. And before we get to her presentation, just some Zoom housekeeping. You're in Zoom webinar, which means that your video and your audio are turned off, but you can ask questions or make comments to us in the chat. Today's program is auto closed caption in English, and you can turn on subtitles with the little CC button in the Zoom toolbar. So we're going to have a presentation from our speaker, followed by Q&A from you. And please feel free to ask any questions that you may have anytime during the program, and I'll just be reading them aloud verbally to Sandrine at the very end. So the program is being recorded, and we'll send a recording as well as the PowerPoint in a follow-up email. And this program, and indeed this program series, was previously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which allowed us to provide high-quality educational programs in fulfillment of our mission. Please consider a donation to CCAHA or perhaps an institutional membership if that applies to you to help keep our webinars free of cost to all. And as a reminder, every little bit helps. So Sandrine, if you could advance the next slide, please. So just a bit about the organization that we work for, CCAHA. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. We're based here in Philadelphia, but we work with organizations all across the country and indeed all across the world. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, artwork on paper, and more. And our preservation services staff work in the field providing educational programs like this one and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. The center also offers a wide range of digitization services as well as fundraising assistance, housing, framing, and more. And you can learn all about what we do at our website, ccha.org. So a bit more about our speaker today. As CCAHA's 2024-25 Paper Conservation Fellow, Sandrine Blais supports the work of the Paper Lab under the supervision of Senior Paper Conservator Heather Hendry. Sandrine graduated from Queen's University, Canada, with an MA in Art Conservation in 2022. She specialized in paper conservation as well as the conservation of photographs and new media. She has completed internships at the National Gallery of Canada and the National Library and Archives of Quebec. Since graduation, she has also done a variety of private work, including helping with mold remediation on an entire mixed media material collection, and she is currently coordinator of the book and paper group of AIC's Conservation Wiki. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Sandrine. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Greg, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to this webinar. So for accessibility reasons, I also want to give a verbal description of myself. So if you're not able to see me currently, I am a white person. I am wearing glasses. I'm also wearing headphones, and there is a white blurry background behind me. So today I want to go over some highlights from my 2-year-long fellowship at CCAHA from 2023 to 2025. So I will go over the lead-white conversion on an Anibali Karachi drawing, a black and lead-white workshop that my supervisor and I co-organized and co-hosted, the foxing reduction of an Andy Warhol color lithograph, the mending and in-painting of a large Japanese screen, and I also want to touch on some workshops that I attended. So the first treatment that I will be talking about is a treatment that I did during the month of January 2024. So Greg talked a little bit about what the Conservation Center is, and I just want to add a bit of information about what the center is and what kind of objects we treat here. So CCAHA is a regional lab, and one of the things that that means is that we do not have our own in-house collection. So we have objects that are being brought in by both private and institutional clients for us to treat, and then usually we will treat them, pack them away, and most of the time we don't see those objects again. But sometimes we do. Sometimes we have objects that are coming back from the same clients. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is the object that I want to be talking about today belongs to the Arkansas Museum of Art. It is entitled Apollo with a Nymph, potentially Eurydice. It was made around 1600 by Anibali Karachi. It is a pen and brown ink drawing with white lead heightenings, and it is a fairly small drawing, so roughly 13 by 9 inches. And this is a drawing that I treated in January of 2024, but this is also a drawing that we had previously treated in the 90s. And since we have treated it in the past, that also means that we have both written and photo documentation that we can refer back to. So back in 1991, when we're looking at the reports and the final documentation, we can see that back then the object was separated from a backing paper. There was the removal of older fills, the reduction of adhesive and overpaint, and then new fills and mends were made. And then when you're looking at the before photo on the left here from 1991, and if you're comparing it to the before treatment photo from 2023, you can see a big difference in the bottom area between the two characters. So you can see those sort of dark brush strokes. And also in the written reports from the 90s, there is no mention of those brush strokes. So our thinking for this, that what we think explained this is that this was most likely white lead highlights that darkened over time and that now have a sort of dark gray metallic appearance. So this is a reaction that can happen sometimes where lead white can react with airborne hydrogen sulfide and leading to a black, gray, or orangey pink discoloration. And you're sometimes able to restore the white appearance or a lighter gray appearance through the chemical conversion treatment that uses hydrogen peroxide by converting the discolored lead sulfide to a white lead sulfate. So for that purpose, the way that I was able to do that treatment was to convert the black and lead white under a stereo microscope using first a 1% hydrogen peroxide solution. So what I did first was to add a bit of ethanol to help the penetration of the hydrogen peroxide to the paint film. And then some areas were very readily converted to a lighter color. And then areas that were a little bit more stubborn, I then bumped up the concentration to a 2% hydrogen peroxide. And I also used a 1% hydrogen peroxide in a 2% methylcellulose poultice. And so methylcellulose is a viscous gel. So what that does is that you're able to paint it on top of the paint film, and that allows for a longer dwell time. So a longer reaction time where you have a longer contact time between the hydrogen peroxide and the darkened lead white. And then you're wicking up excess methylcellulose using a blotter paper. Then something that is important to note when you're working with lead white conversion is that you want to be able to allow your treated object to be aired out for as long as possible, ideally around a week, to allow residual peroxide to decompose and evaporate. So if you were to use hydrogen peroxide in an aqueous treatment, so if you were to wash something overall using hydrogen peroxide or in a way that you can then rinse overall, that would be ideal. But since this is not an object that we were going to be washing overall, the idea is that instead of rinsing out the hydrogen peroxide, you're allowing it to be in contact with the air for as long as possible to allow that hydrogen peroxide to decompose. So this is the setup that you see on the photo here. This is metal corners that we have just to elevate an egg crate, and the object is on the egg crate to allow for as much air circulation as possible. Then when you're looking at the before and after treatment photos, this was really kind of a magical treatment in the sense of those black and the highlights are really disappearing in the after treatment photographs. So this was a very satisfying treatment to do under the microscope and to really see them blend in the background. And some of the areas that I treated included not only the brushstrokes between the two characters, but also if you're looking at the nymphs on her thigh and on her elbow, there was a bit of discoloration. And then on Apollo's sort of wrist area on his thigh, and then in the foliage in the background. So there were a couple of those areas that I treated. So this treatment was really my introduction to the concept of lead white and its discoloration, and that is really what made me want to go further into that research. So this leads me to my next topic, which was a one-day workshop that my supervisor Hendry and I co-organized and co-hosted in April of this year. So to backtrack a little bit, the reason why we wanted to host a workshop about that topic is that when you're thinking of lead white was the white pigment that was most prominently used as early as the 4th century BC. It is also one of the earliest synthetic pigments that exists. And it was used from the 4th century BC until it was phased out with the invention of zinc white and titanium white in the 19th century. But over time, lead white can react with airborne hydrogen sulfide, leading to a black, a gray, or like an orangey pink discoloration. It is also often associated with European old master drawings, as you can see with the example on the left here, but it also can very much be found in American art as well. So the example on the right is from the painter Thomas Chambers. And Thomas Chambers is an English-born painter, but he spent most of his life in the United States, and he most likely made that drawing when he was living in the United States. So as previously mentioned, you can restore the white appearance, or you can get sometimes to a lighter gray or you can go from a gray to like an orangey pink color using the chemical conversion that uses hydrogen peroxide to convert the discolored lead sulfide to a white lead sulfate. However, there are many different application methods, and there's a lot of factors that determine whether treatment should be pursued and how that treatment should be pursued using what method, because there are different ways that you can bring the hydrogen peroxide to the object. Something to note also is that it is purely an aesthetic treatment, but it often enables the display of previously unexhibitable works of art, since the lead white is usually utilized in areas that are meant to be highlights, but now appear as gray or black, and they can be quite disfiguring, as you see in both of those examples. So the workshop was a one-day workshop hosted at both the Philadelphia Museum of Art and CCAHA on April 4th of this year. It was designed for practicing paper conservators, and it focused on the conversion of black and lead white in paper-based artworks. As previously mentioned, it was co-hosted by Hendry, who's the senior paper conservator at CCHA, as well as myself. And the program combined both technical background with hands-on practice of treatment methods. I was also able to reach out to Christina Taylor, who's a paper conservator at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and she was really gracious in her time to help us pull out some examples from the PMA's collection to be able to show participants. So our learning objectives for this workshop was that participants were expected to understand the chemistry of lead carbonate and mechanisms of discoloration, to recognize discolored lead white on paper, both in watercolor and oil paints, to get hands-on experience with various treatment techniques, and to evaluate the risks, the benefits, and the ethics of pursuing a conversion treatment. So the first step for that workshop was to prepare some samples that participants could try their hands with. So to create the samples, I followed Emily Muller's article from 2022, where she makes her black and lead white samples using a 5% gum arabic solution. Then she mixes equal parts gum arabic and lead white together, and she grinds them on a glass sheet under a glass molar. Do note that this is a lead paint, so you do have to be careful with wearing appropriate PPE. You can see in the background that this was made in a fume hood, so you have to be very careful during that steps to protect yourself. I then painted 3 strokes per samples on a variety of papers, and I mixed some of the lead white watercolors with either organic or inorganic green and blue watercolors to see how that would affect treatment. But something that I found that is maybe obvious when you're thinking about it is that freshly painted watercolors are very soluble in hydrogen peroxide. So what I did is I painted some samples using a watercolor medium that is called Aquafix, which made the samples much less water sensitive. Then when I first started creating samples, when I first started designing that research project, one of my colleagues at CCAHA, Joanna Hurd, who is a photo and paper conservator, gave me the brilliant idea to make my samples 2 by 2 inches, which is the dimensions of photographic slides, meaning that my samples would fit in everything that was made for those slides. So in transparent slide sheets and in slide boxes, and that really helped keep me organized. So I highly recommend if you have to make samples in the future. Then to make those samples darken, a lot of research articles expose their samples to gaseous hydrogen sulfide, but that requires a setup that I didn't really have access to. So instead, I followed the 2003 article from Goetz et al., where he creates hydrogen sulfide in a microenvironment by having a reaction between a small amount of zinc sulfide and, quote, moisture in the air. And then the authors of this paper also mentioned that zinc sulfide is inexpensive, relatively non-toxic. It reacts slowly over 0 to 24 hours, enough with air to allow easy handling for these experiments. For me, I found that it took between a day and a few days for the samples to blacken to the level that I wanted them. And so the way that I was making that microenvironment was first by taking a plastic wash tray, so a large plastic tray, and then in it placing whey boats with a small amount of zinc sulfide, and zinc sulfide is a salt, so it looks like a powder, and then beakers next to it with deionized water and a few drops of glacial acetic acid. Then setting an crate on top of that with the unblackened samples on top, and then placing the entire tray in a polyethylene bag, then sealing it with either tape or clips, depending on what was easiest. So back to the workshop. The workshop was a one-day workshop on April 4th of this year, and we started the morning at the Philadelphia Museum of Art to look at real-life examples, and then we moved to CCHA in the afternoon to try our hands with the hands-on portion of that workshop using the prepared samples that I just talked about. So for the morning workshop, I started by delivering a lecture on the fundamentals of lead white, including its historical use, basic chemistry, and the mechanisms behind its darkening. Following the lectures, the participants paired up to examine selected works on paper in the museum's collection that exhibited lead white discoloration, some of which also had previously undergone conversion treatments. After this close-looking session, we reconvened for a group discussion where participants shared their observations, and we compared findings and raised questions about condition, materials, and past interventions. So again, I really want to be thanking Christina Taylor, one of the Philadelphia Museum of Art's conservators, who was very gracious with her time and did a lot of research to find which examples in their collection had darkened lead white, either known or suspected. So that made a really successful workshop. Then in the afternoon, we moved back to CCAHA, and Heather Hendry delivered a lecture on specific treatment methods for discolored lead white, covering the practical considerations, the benefits, and the risks of various approaches. This was followed by a hands-on session where participants tested and compared several treatment techniques using pre-prepared samples. Then we also had a CCHA lab tour, and the participants had an opportunity to speak with her staff. So next, I want to talk about a treatment that I did in 2023 and 2024 about the foxing reduction of an Andy Warhol lithograph. So this is a print entitled Liz Number 2 by Andy Warhol, made around 1966. It is privately owned and it is made using lithographic inks on wove paper, and it measured around 24 by 24 inches roughly. The print exhibited extensive foxing across the sheet. On the recto, it was mainly visible in the peach skin tone, slightly visible in the red background and the magenta lips and the teal eyeshadow, and not really perceptible in the black ink areas. The sheet was discolored overall to a light brown with diffused localized areas of less discoloration, so discolored overall, but sort of in an uneven way. The edges were more discolored and slightly brittle, and the edges were also creased due to the print being slightly larger than the backing board. There were very small edge tears and tiny losses, but none larger than 1/8 of an inch. There was very little overall surface grime, and the media was stable and well adhered. Something that the preliminary spot testing found also is that the red and magenta inks were very water sensitive. However, the peach and teal appeared stable in both deionized water and sodium citrate. The black became slightly friable when wet, but not soluble. So for the treatment steps, the first treatment was to surface clean overall with polyurethane cosmetic sponges and a soft brush. Then to do the stain reduction of the foxing using a variety of treatments that I will go over in the next few slides. And then I mended the edge tears and bridged the losses using toned mulberry paper and wheat starch paste. Then the print was humidified and flattened overall, and then some areas where there was some of the foxing production done in the face area needed a bit of inpainting, and so I did a small amount of inpainting using pastel crayons. Then on the slide, you also have the photo that the print is based off of. So this is a publicity photo of Elizabeth Taylor taken for her 1960 film Butterfield 8. And so it is the inspiration for the Andy Warhol print. So for the stain reduction, due to the media solubility issues, local stain reduction could only be safely pursued in the face area. So the first way that the stain reduction was the first idea for doing the stain reduction was going to be using a suction table. So the print was first placed face up on the suction table with the sensitive inks masked with a cut mylar. Then a 1% sodium citrate was applied overall by spring and locally applied with a paintbrush. So this is what it looks like in this video here. And this process proved to be very slow and inefficient, as the suction table was unable to dry the print quickly enough to assess the reduction. There was also another issue, which was the differential humidity between the masked and the wet areas, which was causing local planar distortions, especially in the chin areas. So for those reasons, that treatment procedure was halted, then the print was allowed to dry overnight between wool printmaking felts. The next option to do the local stain reduction was going to be to use agarose gels. So agarose gels between a 4 and 8% concentration were soaked overnight in a 1% sodium citrate and were used locally on the foxing stains both. I tried both on the recto and the verso. And it was found to be also unsuccessful because it contained too much moisture. It was overlightening the treated areas, and it was hard to control. And so the fact that the paper itself was quite discolored on top of having the foxing made it so that the gel poultices really wanted to clean the overall area instead of really focusing on the foxing. And then when you're looking at the image on the right here, you can see that tide lines were also caused by using the gels in the shape of the gel. So this was going to give me just more things to worry about, so I also halted that procedure. The step that was found successful was using a suction platen instead of a suction table. And so one of the ways that I hear Greg mention suction table, I think is a very good description of what you're looking at. So in a suction table, Greg likes to mention to compare it to like a reverse hockey table. So instead of shooting air out, it is pulling air in. And a suction platen is essentially like a miniature version of a suction table. And so it's in roughly 8 by 8 inch little suction area. And the fact that it is much smaller means that it has a much stronger draw, but you have to work in smaller sections than you would with a suction table. So for this purpose, the print was placed face up on the section platen. Then I used a paintbrush to paint 1% sodium citrate directly on the foxed areas. And then I rinsed with that same method using a paintbrush with calcium bicarbonate. I also attempted using a higher sodium citrate concentration, so up to 5%, but I found that it was affecting the media, resulting in a grayish tone, and so I stuck with a 1% sodium citrate instead. And this was found to be a successful method, but a very slow method because you can see the sort of like 1 inch by 1 inch square that I was working on, and that took an amount of time, and then you would be moving it throughout the entire face area, so it took a fairly long time. But then I think this was also a very successful treatment when you're looking at the before and after treatment images. And when you're doing stain reduction in general, your goal is not so much to completely hide the stains, it is to reduce them. And so you're trying to just make it not as obvious. So in the after treatment image, you can see that you're more looking at the image overall and at Elizabeth Taylor's face as opposed to really focusing on the foxing. The last treatment that I want to be talking about today was the treatment of a large Japanese screen. So this is an object that both my supervisor and I treated together a few months ago, and this was a very large Japanese screen measuring a total of 67.5 by 120 inches, so approximately 5.5 feet high by 10 feet long. As you can see on the photo on the slide, the screen had to be laid out on 4 consecutive tables to accommodate its size. So this was one of the biggest challenge for this object was the sheer size of it. And it is a 6-panel Japanese screen entitled Two Tigers. It was made around 1818. It is privately owned. It is a watercolor on gold background, and it is a traditional mulberry paper screen panels with mulberry paper hinges. So traditionally, a Japanese screen is constructed of layers of papers that are stretched over a wooden lattice, and the primary papers with the image layer are not adhered to the underlying paper layers. You can also find those same layers of papers on the versa of the lattice as well. Then for this specific objects, the main condition issues were the following. There were a number of tears, cracks, and punctures, including the longest one being a 33-inch long vertical split, an 8-inch vertical split, 2 8-inch cracks, many 1/2 inch to 2-inch cracks and punctures throughout, and then a variety of old repairs and overpaint had previously been done. And so many of those repairs were secured, but they were overpainted with a mismatched darker gold than the surrounding gold. And the edges were often glued to the underlying paper layers, which was causing cockling from its tension. So this is a before treatment image where I marked the main areas that we focused on during the treatment. And the first goal of this treatment was to provide physical stabilization of the tears to prevent further damage. The second goal was the aesthetic reintegration of previous inpainting. So the most urgent condition issues were the large open cracks and tears in several of the panels, including the ones that I mentioned at the previous slide. And the main tear, the 33-inch long tear, is on the second panel if we're looking at it from the left side, which is circled in blue. Then, as mentioned, there are also a number of previous repairs that were still held securely, but generally the previous repairs had been overpainted with a darker gold tone that does not match the background gold. Presumably that gold in painting used to be a better color match, but has since darkened. And so nowadays it is quite disfiguring, especially if you're looking at the bottom left corner of the first panel. And the edge tears of those previous repairs also seem to have been glued to the underlying paper layers, resulting in a tension that was causing radiating cockles from the large tears, but they were still securely held. And in some cases, the tension from those repairs had also caused adjacent splits. And there were also various areas of smaller repairs and dark overpainting throughout the screens. There are several more skillful repairs that include high-quality fills on the bottom of the first panel and repairs to the hinges, both of which were in very good conditions, both of which we did not address. But overall, the media, the support lattice, and the silk borders were in good condition. And thankfully, at the very least, most of the slits and punctures were not in the image area. So the first treatment step was to surface clean loose grime using a soft brush. Then for mending, we really wanted to focus on the worst tears first, and then we reassessed as we were going to see which smaller cracks and punctures we would also have time to mend, some of which included removing previous repairs, but most of the previous repair that were deemed stable were left in place. So for mending, we followed a technique described by my supervisor, Heather Hendry, and Juliet Baines in their 2018 article from the Journal of Paper Conservation, entitled A Local Mending Technique for Japanese Screens. So in that article, the authors describe an in situ mending technique that prevents the need for fully disassembling and remounting the screen, which is a level of treatment that is not generally done in Western conservation studios. So I encourage you to go read the article for very clear step-by-step instructions, but essentially we were using quote unquote floating pillows, mends. And so those mends are constructed with a support layer of mulberry paper that is laminated with wheat starch paste. Then on top of it, you put a thinner mending paper that is adhered only along the edges of the support layer, but loose in the center, hence the pillow. Then the mend is inserted below the image layer, and the edges of the tears are adhered to the mending paper with wheat starch paste. Then during mending, the tear area is misted with deionized water to relax the paper, and as it dries, the tension of the screen structure is pulling the mend flat. And you can see with the example on the right of the screen here that this was very successful for this object. So the tears that were creating some amount of cockling were laid much flatter. There was also a need to repair one of the hinges, which had a split that may have developed during the transport of the screen. Then the hinge was mended by inserting a mulberry paper strip between the hinge layers and adhering it with wheat starch paste. The lowest part of the hinge was also reinforced on the exterior using a piece of mulberry paper that was pre-toned with gold acrylic paint and adhered with wheat starch paste. Many older repairs were still strongly adhered and were not treated, although they were causing some amount of tension and cockling. And then the example that you have on the left of the screen here is that very long tear, and you can see that after treatment, the tear is laying much flatter. So the next step was to in-paint. Since the screen was going to be eventually displayed upright, it was important that we in-painted in that same position as well. But I will say it was definitely a bit of a challenge to be able to move it up on those tables to have it upright. And we overpainted the most distracting areas of dark in painting using gold watercolors. And as previously mentioned, we think that it is likely that the previous in painting used to be a better color match, but it has darkened over time. And however, in our in painting, the mica pigments in the watercolor are stable and they will not darken over time. However, they do have a slightly sparkly appearance in contrast to the smooth, shiny metal of the gold background. The appearance of the new in-painting is significantly improved, but not invisible. You can still kind of tell that there is in-painting there. Then in the very long gap that I mentioned, in the very long tear that I mentioned, there was a slight gap between the edges of the tear. And so this was also in painting, but using an isolating layer of methylcellulose first, then in painting on top of that. Then in the after treatment image, you can see that the main splits and tears are mended and that the distracting previous overpaint has been toned down, especially if you're looking at the bottom left corner. So the idea was not to completely hide all of that previous work, all of that previous overpaint, but just to knock it down so that you or I would focus on the image area instead. And the last thing I want to mention for this webinar are the many workshops that I was able to attend as part of my fellowship. And I really want to be thanking CCAHA for their support in allowing me to attend all of these workshops. So I was thankful enough to attend two printmaking workshops taught by Christina Taylor, who is the Philadelphia Museum of Art paper conservator, as well as Christopher Wallace, who is an artist. And the first workshop that I attended was at AIC of 2024, so at a professional conference where we were looking at soft ground etching. We covered the basics of etching and advanced lift ground techniques, including sugar lift, soap, soap ground, and aquatint. And these are techniques that were invented in the 17th century but revived in the 19th century and that are still used today. It was primarily a hands-on printing um, workshop with supplemental history and technique lectures. Then a few months later in Philadelphia, I was able to follow a workshop by those same presenters about lithography, which introduced historical and contemporary lithographic processes, including stone lithography, which included both additive and reductive techniques, plate lithography, pronto plates, which is color lithography, transfer lithography, photolithography, and then we did 2 days of activities at Second State Press in Philadelphia, including lectures. And then on the last day, we went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art to look at the print study collections from the Philadelphia Museum of Art's collection. So it was really great to have that time to learn about lithography and try our hands at lithography first, and then move to the PMA to look at real life examples. And this workshop is really what inspired the Black and Lead White workshop to try and keep a similar structure. Then the my last two workshops that I want to mention that I attended is one that was hosted by Michelle Sullivan, looking at rigid hydrogels. So that focused on rigid polysaccharide gels, including gelling gum and agarose in paper conservation, and its applications for paper conservation, including paper washing, stain reduction, tape removal. And then we also mentioned the addition of enzymes, chelating agents, and solvents to gels. And then the last workshop that I attended is one at AIC this year, so at the professional conference in Minneapolis, which was about the topic of nanocellulose, and it was taught by Rémi Dreyfus-Desagne, who is also a former CCAHA fellow. And in that workshop, we explored nanocellulose gels and films, or nanopapers in conservation. It was a 2-day intensive workshop where we both looked at theory and had hands-on activities. We covered making MFC films, CNC films, and nanocomposites. And then we talked about different applications of those films on translucent and transparent supports, especially. I want to take a moment to thank everyone who supported me during my fellowship. I'm deeply grateful, especially to my supervisor, Heather Hendry, for her guidance and encouragement during this learning process, as well as to my colleagues who always kept me in a good mood and gave me brilliant conservation tips. Your expertise, encouragement, and generosity have made this experience both professionally enriching and personally meaningful. Thank you for being such an important part of this journey. Thank you also to everyone watching for attending. I put up my personal email on this slide in case you have any questions that come up after this presentation. Otherwise, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have now to the best of my abilities.
Thank you, Sandrine. That was great.
Okay.
Really
Thanks, Greg.
appreciate that for getting that overview. It's been nice because I obviously see you work in the lab, but it's nice to see all of the things that we've been working
Yeah.
on since we've been here. Now's the time for questions if anybody has them. I think and I'll give it a minute as people
Hmm.
ponder and think about their questions. But I have one for you if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
I was just kind of reflecting on, I think one thing that your presentation reinforces for me is just all of the kind of professional development opportunities that are available for conservators out there.
Yes.
It's something I really love about the field is that y'all are always constantly learning and trying new things and creating new knowledge. And I was just curious, now that you're kind of at the end of your fellowship, reflecting back on it, are there things that you've learned during your time here that were maybe especially surprising, especially unique, um, you know, that you weren't expecting, those kinds of things, as you're thinking back?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a very large lab in terms of we have many, many conservators who work here, and so you're always learning new tips and tricks from the different conservators and the different staff. Or you have the institutional knowledge of someone saying, "Oh, I've treated something very similar 9 years ago. This is roughly what I did, I think." And then you can go back in the documentation and have a bit more information there. And something especially in taking the printmaking workshops, it's always kind of astonishing to me when you're looking at what artists are doing and then being like, I would have never considered that someone would do that. So I'll keep an eye out when I have a print that is maybe more modern or contemporary that may have slightly shifted from traditional techniques. So I think this was really interesting to take those workshops and see what people are doing these days and how they're approaching it from the artistic side of things.
Nice, thank you. So I see a couple questions in the chat. I'm gonna go with the more technical one first, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So Loretto is asking, what is the difference between hydrogen peroxide and sodium citrate in reducing foxing? Advantage or disadvantage, if there is one?
I think sodium citrate in general is my go-to for stain reduction. So sodium citrate is I'll be more technical for that very specific question, but sodium citrate is a chelating agent. When we're talking to clients who maybe don't have that technical background, we also describe it as a washing aid. So it is not a bleach. It is something that sort of helps remove discoloration products further than just water. And so it is especially helpful for foxing and also on the technical knowledge. When you're looking at foxing, we're looking at basically a localized uh, oxidation of the cellulose, and this can be introduced by either metallic inclusions in the paper or mold or a combination of both. So like uh, fungus essentially. And we're not really sure what we're looking at when you're looking at an object. If you're not doing in-depth analysis, you're not really sure what is causing that foxing. And so going with sodium citrate, since it is a chelating agent, it is very good for using with metal induced foxing. So sodium citrate would be my go-to for foxing in general. I will say hydrogen peroxide, I would use, it works very well for lead white discoloration. It is not so much something that I would use for foxing reduction. I think hydrogen peroxide has its purposes in other areas. I think it's very good for mold stains especially. But it wouldn't be my go-to in general. I think sodium citrate I'm more comfortable with. I know that it is not a bleach. You can rinse it out. So hydrogen peroxide would not generally be my go-to for foxing, but generally you start with what you're more comfortable with, and then if that doesn't work for your stain reduction, then you can explore um, other options.
Nice, thank you, Sandrine. And this is just a question from our staff here at CCA, but CCHA, but if you could just talk a little bit more about where you're going next after the fellowship.
Oh, sure. I wasn't sure if I was going to mention it, but I will mention it now. So starting in mid-September, I will have a year-long position at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So I will be working as an assistant paper conservator. And essentially what they're doing right now is that they are renovating their modern and contemporary wing for a large project. And so I will be documenting and working on those objects that are still in the collection to get them out of there for them to be able to do that renovation work.
Yep, very exciting. Um, and I'll maybe just last call for questions, but if we don't have any questions, and Sandrine, you're getting lots of thanks and congratulations in the chat, including some in French, which we love to see. Uh, and I'll just also echo our thanks. Thank you, Sandrine, and big thanks to Camilla Dawson, who's been behind the scenes doing all of the tech and setup for today's webinar. Our next webinar is going to be From Chaos to Clarity, Centralize Your Collection with a Digital Platform. That'll be on September 16th at noon. We hope to see you there. And when this program ends, there's going to be a little survey that pops up, and you can tell us how we did with our webinar today, and any feedback you may have for us. And please also, if you are feeling inspired and motivated to donate, we definitely always appreciate that. And best wishes, Sandrine. I know I'll see you around for a few more weeks here, but and then it's bon voyage to New York. So all right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and have a lovely afternoon or whatever time it might be when you're tuning in here.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Camilla.
Thank you.